What would you do if the only thing you inherited from a lifetime of loss was a sound? Not a house, not a parcel of farmland, not even a pocket watch, but the deed to a waterfall, a ceaseless roar of water tumbling over a cliffside nobody wanted. For 18-year-old Iris May Calloway, this wasn't a question. It was the final, baffling postscript to her father's quiet, lonely life. The town of Fern Hollow called it a fool's inheritance, a cruel joke played on an orphan girl with nothing to her name but a threadbare coat and a stubborn old mule. But the truth waiting behind that curtain of mist and stone was a secret that would not only redefine the father she thought she knew, but the very meaning of what it is to own something. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who was left nothing but a waterfall and found everything, the air in Mr. Finch's law office was thick with the smell of old paper and beeswax, a scent that clung to the heavy silence in the room. Iris May Calloway sat on a stiff horsehair chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster. She was 18, but the last week had carved years into the lines around her eyes. Her father, Elias Calloway, had been buried 2 days prior in the small churchyard overlooking the valley, a simple pine box lowered into the rocky soil. Now came the final accounting of his life. Her 2 half-brothers, grown men with hard faces and her father's first wife's eyes, sat opposite her. They had never offered her a kind word, and they did not start now. Mr. Finch, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched with mild disapproval, cleared his throat and read from the will. To Jedediah and Caleb, he bequeathed the 40-acre homestead, the cabin, the barn, all livestock save one, the wagon, the tools, the traps, everything of practical value, everything that meant survival. A low grunt of satisfaction came from her brothers. Then, the lawyer turned his gaze to Iris May, and to my daughter, Iris May Calloway. He read, his voice devoid of emotion. I leave my sole remaining parcel, that which is known as Calloway Falls, and all the mist that rises from it. May she find in its voice the peace I never could. Silence. Jedediah snorted, a sharp, ugly sound. A patch of wet rocks and noise, fitting. Iris May didn't flinch. She felt a cold stillness settle over her, the familiar companion of grief. She had expected nothing, and this was somehow less than that. It was poetry, and poetry couldn't fill a stomach or mend a roof. After signing the papers, her knuckles white around the pen, she walked out into the pale mountain light. Her brother Caleb stopped her on the boardwalk. You'll be wanting to sell that foolishness, he said, not unkindly, but with the weary impatience of a man swatting a fly. Silas Croft might give you $10 for the timber rights, though there ain't much timber on it. She looked at him, at the face so like her father's but missing the deep-set sadness she knew so well. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'll keep it. He just shook his head and walked away, leaving her alone on the dusty street with the deed in her pocket and her father's old gray mule, Gideon, tethered to the hitching post. The mule was the only other thing the will had granted her. Gideon blinked his long-lashed, knowing eyes and nudged her hand with his soft nose, as if to say, well, what now? The deed felt thin and brittle in her hands, a piece of paper that represented the sum of her worldly possessions, Calloway Falls. She'd seen it only a handful of times as a child, a landmark on the far edge of their trapping lines. To everyone in Fern Hollow, it was just that, a landmark, a place where the creek took a sudden dive off the black ridge, a spectacle of white water and spray that was pretty to look at but utterly useless. The land was a steep, rocky gorge, impossible to farm, treacherous to log. The water itself ran too fast and shallow for a mill. It was, as her brother had so bluntly put it, a view. and a view was a luxury for people who had a window to look out of. Iris May had no window. She had a canvas roll with a blanket and a spare shirt, a small sack of flour, and the mule, Gideon, who now carried it all. Her father's cabin, the only home she'd ever known, was no longer hers. Jedediah's wife had made that clear before the dirt on the grave had even settled. She spent a night in the livery stable, the owner taking pity on her and allowing her the use of an empty stall in exchange for a few hours of mucking out. The smell of hay and horse was more comforting than the cloying scent of Mr. Finch's office. The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, she decided there was only one place to go. If she owned the falls, then she would go to them. Leading Gideon by his rope, she walked out of Fern Hollow, her back to the whispers and the pitying glances. The trail to the falls was little more than a game path, winding up through dense stands of pine and hemlock. The air grew cooler, damper, and the sound began long before the sight. A low, distant rumble that grew into a steady, percussive roar. It was the sound of something immense and eternal, a sound that had been here long before the town of Fern Hollow, and would be here long after. She and Gideon emerged from the trees onto a rocky outcrop, and there it was, a sheet of water at least 100 feet high, crashing down into a deep, stone-lined pool. The mist, just as the will had said, rose in a constant, shimmering cloud, coating every rock and leaf with a slick sheen of moisture. It was beautiful, fiercely so, and it was utterly desolate. The ground was a jumble of moss-covered boulders and thin, acidic soil where only ferns and hardy weeds could grow. There was no flat piece of earth to pitch a tent, no pasture for Gideon, no hope of a garden. It was exactly as worthless as everyone had said. She slid the pack from Gideon's back and sank onto a cold, damp rock, the roar of the water filling her ears, her head, her whole being. It felt like the physical embodiment of her own crushing loss. What was she supposed to do with this? How could a father leave his only daughter a legacy of rushing water and cold stone? Was it a final bitter joke? Or was there something hidden in the roar that only she was meant to hear? Let us know what you think he intended in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden truths and quiet triumphs. Now, let's get back to Iris May, as the town began to take notice of the girl who lived by the waterfall. News traveled fast in a place like Fern Hollow, carried on the currents of gossip that flowed from the general store to the saloon to the church steps. The story of Iris May Calloway and her peculiar inheritance became a source of amusement, a bit of local folklore in the making. Men at the saloon would laugh over their beers. Heard Elias Calloway left that girl of his the prettiest piece of useless land in the county, one would say. Gave her the deed to a waterfall. The laughter that followed was loud and dismissive. Silas Croft, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his tailored city coat, found it particularly funny. Croft was buying up parcels all over the valley, consolidating small homesteads into a larger tract for a timber operation he planned to bring in from the east. He saw Iris May outside the general store, loading a small bag of oats onto Gideon's back. He tipped his hat with a theatrical flourish, his smile thin and predatory. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice loud enough for others on the boardwalk to hear. "I hear congratulations are in order. You're a landowner." Iris May said nothing, just cinched the rope on the sack. "A fine piece of property," he continued, undeterred by her silence. "All that atmosphere." He waved a hand vaguely in the direction of the mountains. "Tell you what, I feel for your situation. I'll give you $20 for it. Cash. Take the burden right off your young shoulders." The offer was an insult, wrapped in false pity. $20 was less than the value of the mule standing beside her. She looked at him, her gaze level and clear. "It's not for sale, Mr. Croft." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Don't be a fool, girl. It's rocks and water. What use could you possibly have for it?" "It was my father's," she said simply. And that was the end of it. She led Gideon away, leaving Croft staring after her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Later that day, as she passed the small cottages on the edge of town, she saw old Elspeth Reed sitting on her porch, her hands busy with a piece of knitting, her eyes watching everything. Elspeth was the town's oldest resident, a woman who seemed woven from the mist and memory of the mountains themselves. As Iris May passed, the old woman's knitting needles stilled. Her voice, when it came, was dry and rustling like autumn leaves. "Some men build walls to keep the world out," Elspeth said, not looking at Iris, but out toward the ridge. "Your father, he built with water to let the right one in." The words made no sense. They hung in the air between them, heavy with a meaning Iris May couldn't grasp. She nodded a polite acknowledgement and continued on her way, the strange sentence echoing in her mind. What door could be made of water, and who was the right one meant to enter it? The cryptic warning or blessing, she wasn't sure which, settled in her heart like a smooth, heavy stone. With the $20 from the sale of a few of her mother's silver buttons, Iris May bought a small canvas tent, a cooking pot, and a bag of beans. There was no other choice but to make a life on the land she had been given. She and Gideon made the trek back to the falls, this time with a sense of grim purpose. She found the most level spot she could, a small patch of earth nestled between three great boulders, partially sheltered from the ceaseless mist. It was damp, but it was hers. The first few days were a study in misery. A persistent drizzle kept everything perpetually wet. Her small fires sputtered and smoked, struggling to combat the dampness that seeped into her clothes, her blanket, her very bones. The roar of the waterfall was a constant, oppressive presence. It wasn't a peaceful sound. It was a physical force, a vibration that worked its way through the soles of her worn boots and up into her teeth. At night, it filled her dreams, a chaotic noise that left no room for peace. Gideon seemed to feel it too. The mule was listless, standing with his head low, his long ears drooping. She spent her days gathering firewood, foraging for edible greens along the creek bed, and trying to create some semblance of order in her small, wet world. She built a small rock wall to divert the worst of the spray from her tent and cleared a patch of ferns to make a path to the pool at the base of the falls. It was hard, lonely work. The sun rarely broke through the canopy of trees, and when it did, the light was splintered and pale, filtered through the ever-present mist. The place felt ancient and indifferent, a corner of the world that had no need for humans and offered them no comfort. One evening, as dusk settled like a gray blanket over the gorge, she sat huddled by her struggling fire, eating a small bowl of beans. The loneliness was a physical ache in her chest. She looked at the waterfall, its white torrent turning a ghostly silver in the fading light. It was a wall, a beautiful, powerful, impassable wall of water that separated her from the rest of the world. She felt a surge of despair, a feeling so sharp it stole her breath. This wasn't a home. It was a prison made of sound and spray. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep that night, the sound of the falls seemed to change. Or perhaps she was just starting to listen differently. Beneath the constant, deafening crash, she thought she could hear something else. A hollow note, an echo that didn't belong. It was a subtle resonance, like the sound of a drum hidden deep within the orchestra of the water. Days bled into a week, then two. A routine, stark and simple, began to form. Wake at dawn, tend the fire, fetch water, check her snares, forage. The work was demanding, but it kept the worst of the despair at bay. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and stained with dirt and berry juice. She grew leaner, tougher, her movements economical and sure. She was becoming part of the place, shaped by its harsh beauty just as the water shaped the stone. And she kept listening. The hollow echo was real. It was most noticeable in the late afternoon, when the wind died down and the air grew still. It seemed to emanate from a specific point behind the main cascade of water, slightly to the north. Gideon noticed it too. The old mule, who had been so dejected, began to spend his days standing on a flat ledge of rock near the pool, his gaze fixed on the spot where the water fell thickest. His ears would swivel, alert and focused, tracking a sound only he could fully discern. He would stand there for hours, patient and watchful, ignoring the sweet patches of clover she found for him further up the trail. His strange vigil was the first real clue. Animals knew things people forgot. One afternoon, while sitting on a rock sketching the patterns of moss on the cliff face with a piece of charcoal, a habit learned from her father, she saw it. The moss wasn't random. On the sheer rock wall beside the falls, a faint, almost invisible line of darker, greener moss snaked its way upward, toward the very place Gideon always watched. It looked less like a natural growth and more like a path, a trail worn by something other than time. That's when a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. She was a little girl, sitting on her father's lap by the fire. He was carving a small wooden bird, the shavings falling like snow onto the hearth. "The best doors don't have hinges, Iris May," he had murmured, his voice raspy from a winter cough. "The best doors are the ones you have to learn to see." A door without hinges, a path made of moss, a hollow sound behind a wall of water. The pieces clicked into place with a sudden heart-stopping clarity. The thought was so wild, so impossible, that she almost dismissed it. But her father had not been a simple man. He was quiet, yes, and poor, but his mind had always worked in strange and winding ways. He had left her the falls for a reason, and she was beginning to suspect that the reason was not in front of the water, but behind it. A thrill, half fear and half hope shot through her. The challenge was no longer just to survive, but to understand. Her decision was made. She would go behind the water. The first step was preparation. The rock face was slick with algae and mist, a treacherous vertical surface. To even approach the ledge behind the cascade, she needed a safer path. For 2 days she labored, her world shrinking to the task at hand. She used Gideon to drag a long, fallen pine log to the edge of the pool. It was heavy, unwieldy work, and the mule grunted in protest. But he seemed to understand the importance of the task, pulling with a strength she hadn't seen in him for months. With her father's small, sharp hand axe, she painstakingly chopped deep notches into the top of the log, creating a crude but serviceable bridge that spanned the most dangerous, slippery section of rocks at the water's edge. Her arms ached, her back screamed, but with every swing of the axe, a sense of purpose grew within her. This was her father's language, the language of wood and stone and patient effort. She was speaking it now, answering a question he had posed long ago. Next, she gathered the longest, sturdiest rope she had. Tying one end around her waist and the other securely to the base of a thick, deep-rooted cedar, she began her ascent. The mossy path was even more precarious up close. It offered little in the way of handholds. She moved slowly, testing every crevice before trusting it with her weight. The spray from the waterfall soaked her within seconds, plastering her hair to her face and chilling her to the bone. The roar was immense, a physical blow that vibrated through her skull, making it impossible to think. She could only feel, and move, and breathe. Inch by painstaking inch, she climbed toward the spot. Finally, her fingers closed around a firm, dry edge of rock. She had reached a ledge, hidden behind the thundering sheet of water. She pulled herself up onto it, her body trembling with cold and exertion. The ledge was about 3 feet wide, a natural shelf in the rock face, but it had been widened and flattened by hand. She could see the tool marks in the stone. It was a deliberate space, and it led to a dark opening in the cliff, a blackness deeper than shadow. The air flowing out of it was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. She stood there for a long moment, catching her breath, the water falling in a deafening silver curtain just inches from her face. She was in a space between worlds, hidden from sight, standing on the threshold of her father's greatest secret. The open loop of his life was about to be closed. With a deep breath, she untied the rope from her waist and took the first step into the darkness. She fumbled in her oilskin pouch, her fingers numb with cold, until they found the tin of matches and the small lantern. The match scraped, flared, and for a moment she saw only her own shaking hand. Then she touched the flame to the lantern's wick, and a warm, golden light pushed back the gloom. She raised it high and gasped. It was not a cave, it was a cabin. A small, perfect room carved from the heart of the mountain. The back and side walls were the living, unhewn rock of the cliff, but the front wall, facing the waterfall, was a masterful construction of river stone and fitted timbers, so expertly camouflaged it would be invisible from the outside. A small, clever chimney was vented up through a natural fissure in the rock. The floor was made of thick, smooth sawn planks. The space was no bigger than a trapper's line shack, but it felt like a cathedral. The air was still and dry, a sanctuary from the damp world outside. A simple cot with a neatly folded wool blanket sat against one wall. A small cast-iron stove stood in the corner, a stack of split firewood beside it. There was a sturdy wooden table and a single chair. But it was the other wall that held her transfixed. It was covered, from floor to ceiling, with shelves, and the shelves were not filled with traps or tools or supplies for survival. They were filled with books, journals bound in leather, tins neatly labeled with the names of seeds, glass jars holding preserved butterflies and beetles, and dozens of wooden boxes containing meticulously organized collections of rocks, feathers, and pressed flowers. This was not the shelter of Elias Calloway, the grim, silent trapper. This was the study of a scholar, a naturalist, an artist. On the table, a single large ledger lay open. Iris May approached it as if it were a sacred text. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover. Inside, the pages were filled not with numbers, but with her father's elegant, precise script and drawings, stunningly detailed sketches in ink and charcoal, the intricate pattern of a hawk's wing, the delicate veins on a maple leaf, the anatomy of a trout. He had been documenting the entire valley, from the smallest insect to the grandest peak. Tucked inside the front cover was a sealed envelope. On it, in that same familiar hand, were 2 words, "For Iris May." Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The letter inside was short. "My daughter," it began. "If you are reading this, you listened. I knew you would. The world saw a trapper, and I let them. It was easier. But this place, this is the truth of me. All I ever learned, all I ever saw, it's here. It was never about owning the land. It was about knowing it. This is your inheritance. Not the water, but what the water protects." She sank into the chair, the letter clutched in her hand, and wept. Not from grief, but from a profound, earth-shattering sense of discovery. She had not been left with nothing. She had been left with everything. The discovery of the cabin changed everything. It was not just a shelter. It was a home, imbued with the spirit of the father she was only now beginning to know. She spent the next weeks exploring its secrets, reading his journals, learning the names he had given to every hidden spring and rare wildflower in the valley. She moved her few belongings inside, and for the first time since his death, she felt a sense of peace. The roar of the waterfall was no longer a torment. It was a lullaby, the sound of her guardian, her door. But the mountain was not done testing her. In late autumn, the sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and a storm of legendary fury descended upon Fern Hollow. The wind howled through the gorge like a hungry animal, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The creek swelled, and the waterfall transformed from a graceful curtain into a raging, violent torrent. The sound was apocalyptic, a physical assault that shook the very rock around her. The cabin, tucked behind the deluge, was safe and dry, but Iris May's heart was tight with fear for Gideon. She had moved him to a deep, sheltered overhang further down the path, but she worried the rising water might reach him. For 2 days the storm raged without ceasing. The world outside her hidden sanctuary was a churning chaos of wind and water. On the 3rd day, during a brief lull when the rain eased to a steady downpour, she heard it. A faint cry, nearly lost in the thunder of the falls. At first she thought it was the wind, but then it came again, sharper this time, desperate. A human voice. Peering through a cleverly designed peephole her father had drilled through the stone wall, she saw them. A woman and a small boy, huddled at the base of the cliff on the opposite side of the now impassable creek. A wrecked wagon lay on its side nearby, one wheel spinning uselessly in the wind. They were soaked, shivering, and trapped. Without a second thought, Iris May grabbed a coil of rope and her warmest blanket. She fought her way through the curtain of water, back out onto the treacherous ledge. Bracing herself against the rock, she yelled, her voice raw, "Over here!" The woman looked up, her face etched with terror and relief. Following Iris May's shouted instructions, the woman tied the rope around her son, and then herself. With all her strength, Iris May pulled them one by one across the churning water to the relative safety of the rocks on her side, and then guided them along the mossy path, behind the waterfall, and into the warm, dry cabin. The woman, whose name was Sarah Weber, stared around in disbelief, her son clinging to her skirts. "It's a miracle," she whispered, her teeth chattering. Iris May stirred the embers in the stove and added fresh wood. "No," she said, handing the woman a warm, dry blanket. "It's just a home." The storm finally broke on the 5th day. The sun emerged pale and watery to illuminate a world washed clean and battered. As soon as the creek subsided enough to be crossed, Sarah Weber's husband, who had been searching frantically for his family, found his way to the falls, led by his wife's shouts. His relief upon finding them safe and warm in the impossible cabin was overwhelming. When the Webers returned to Fern Hollow, their story spread like wildfire. They spoke of the trapper's strange daughter, not as a fool, but as a hero. They described a secret home hidden behind the water, a place of warmth and scholarship, filled with books and maps and wonders. The tale was too fantastic to be ignored. A few days later, a small procession of townspeople made their way up the trail to Callaway Falls, led by a curious and skeptical Silas Croft. He still believed it was a tall tale, some trick of the light or a flight of fancy from a terrified woman. Iris May met them at the entrance to the gorge. She said nothing, simply led them along the path she had cleared, over the log bridge, and onto the ledge. One by one they stepped behind the curtain of water and into the cabin. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. They stood in stunned silence, looking at the shelves, the drawings, the neat stacks of journals. They saw not the squalor of a hermit, but the ordered, beautiful world of a genius. Silas Croft's face was a mask of disbelief. He ran a hand over a smooth, carved bird, then picked up a journal, his eyes scanning the detailed drawings of plant root systems. He saw value here, but it was a value he couldn't measure in board feet or dollar bills. He had mocked her for inheriting a view, and she had inherited a universe. The town clerk, Mr. Abernathy, had come with them, bringing his surveying tools and the official town maps. He spent an hour taking measurements, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he straightened up and looked at Iris May, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "It's all here, clear as day," he announced to the assembled group. "The deed specifies the falls and the land 50 feet from its source on all sides. This cabin, it's well within the legal boundaries. Your father, Miss Calloway," he said, his voice carrying a new weight, "deeded you a home, a most extraordinary home." The whispers of the townspeople were no longer of mockery, but of awe. The girl with the fool's inheritance had become the keeper of the valley's soul. A quiet season of grace settled over the gorge. The town, having seen the truth of Elias Calloway's legacy, rewrote its memory of him. He was no longer just a poor, solitary trapper, but the secret guardian of the valley, its quiet observer. And Iris May was his heir, not just to his property, but to his purpose. People began to make the trek to the falls, not out of idle curiosity, but with a kind of reverence. They brought her things, a sack of potatoes from one farmer, a jar of preserved peaches from another's wife, a set of new leather straps for Gideon's harness from the blacksmith. They were small offerings of apology and respect. Silas Croft never made another offer on the land. He was seen once more, standing on the opposite side of the creek, just looking at the falls, a strange, contemplative expression on his face. He tipped his hat to Iris May, a gesture no longer mocking but deferential, and then turned and walked away. A young farmer named Thomas Gable, whose land bordered the Calloway parcel, became a quiet, steady presence. He helped her build a small, sturdy paddock for Gideon in a sheltered clearing, and showed her how to clear a small patch of land for a garden, explaining how his own father had learned to work the thin mountain soil. He never overstayed his welcome, speaking little, but his help was practical and his presence comforting. One evening, in the golden hour when the sun slanted through the pines and turned the waterfall's mist into a veil of liquid gold, Iris May sat at her father's desk. The lantern cast a warm glow on the open page of his journal. She was tracing the delicate lines of a drawing he had made of a rare mountain orchid, one he had found blooming in a single hidden cleft of rock high on the Black Ridge. Thomas had brought a small sack of flour and a few late-season apples, and now stood beside her, looking over her shoulder at a large, intricate map of the valley spread across the table. It was a masterpiece of cartography, showing every stream, every game trail, every ancient stand of trees. "He knew this place," Thomas said softly, his voice full of wonder. "He knew it better than anyone." Iris May looked from the map to the drawing of the flower, and then out through the shimmering curtain of water at the world beyond. A profound understanding settled over her, the final piece of her inheritance clicking into place. "He didn't own the land," she said, her voice quiet and sure. "He just paid attention to it." She was home, truly home, surrounded not by walls of wood and stone, but by a legacy of quiet observation and deep, abiding love. Thank you for staying with us for this story of discovery and the quiet power of looking closer. If you were moved by Iris May's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story with heart. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. We'll be telling the story of an old fisherman who buys a wrecked boat for $1, only to find a secret hidden in its hull that will change his town forever. Until then, be well, and remember to look for the beauty hidden in plain sight. What would you do if the only home you'd ever known was stolen from you with a piece of paper? For Fanny Marsh, a quiet woman of 29 in the vast, unforgiving expanse of 1870s Colorado, This wasn't a question. It was the cold iron truth. She was driven from her late father's valley homestead by a cattle company that claimed her deed, the paper he'd treasured his entire life, was a forgery. But the truth waiting for her in the shadow of a shunned and forgotten silver mine would not only challenge the most powerful men in the territory, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of how being cast out can sometimes be the only way to find your way home. The dust of the road clung to the hem of Fanny's worn wool skirt, a second skin of grit and defeat. She stood before the Providence Gulch Mercantile, the false-fronted buildings of the town looming like judgmental elders. In her hand, she held the notice from the Sterling Cattle Company. The ink was stark and merciless against the cheap paper, declaring her father's deed to their quarter section null and void. A clerk's error from decades past, they called it. A clerical oversight that just so happened to favor the largest and most powerful ranching outfit west of the Divide. Fanny had ridden into town that morning with a quiet hope, a belief in the simple fairness of things. She'd stood before the county clerk, a man with a perpetually sweating brow, and presented her father's papers. He hadn't been able to meet her eyes. He'd merely pushed the Sterling Company's notice across the counter, his finger tracing the signature of its regional director, Elias Thorne. "I'm sorry, Miss Marsh," he'd muttered. "Their claim is formidable." Now, leaning against the rough sawn planks of the mercantile wall, the weight of her loss settled not in her mind, but deep in her bones. She remembered her father, a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the mountains that cradled their home, pressing the deed into her hand just before he'd passed the winter before. "This is more than paper, Fan," he'd rasped, his voice thin as autumn smoke. "This is sweat. This is roots. Don't let anyone ever tell you it ain't yours." The memory was a fresh pain, a hot coal in the pit of her stomach. She had failed him. The town bustled around her, a river of noise and indifference. Men in dusty hats tipped their brims to passing ladies, their glances sliding right past Fanny as if she were a ghost already. She was a woman alone, without land, without family, without a single dollar to her name beyond the few coins in her pocket, meant for salt and flour. Her world had been reduced to what she could carry: the clothes on her back, a small satchel of her mother's things, and the aging, sad-eyed mule, Jedediah, currently tied to the hitching post, his ears drooping in sympathetic misery. Elias Thorne himself had ridden past not an hour ago, his horse a fine, glossy black that seemed to sneer at Jedediah's dusty coat. Thorne had met her gaze, a flicker of triumphant cruelty in his eyes, before turning away. He hadn't needed to say a word. The message was clear: you are nothing. You are gone. The sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The air grew colder. People were heading home, to warm stoves and evening meals. Home, the word was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. She couldn't go back to the homestead. Thorne's men were likely already there, running her few chickens and turning their cattle onto her father's carefully tended pasture. She had nowhere to go. A gust of wind whipped down the street, carrying the scent of pine and the deeper, colder smell of the high country. It also carried a memory, another one of her father's stories, told on a winter night by the fire. He'd spoken of the old Silence Mine, a failed silver strike up the canyon, sealed and abandoned 30 years ago. He'd mentioned a small, unclaimed parcel of government land beside it, a piece nobody wanted because it was too rocky, too steep, and too close to a place the townspeople refused to speak of. A place of bad luck and buried secrets. At the time, it was just a story. Now, it was a destination. It was the only direction left to go. Fanny untied Jedediah's reins, her movements slow and deliberate, each one an act of defiance against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The mule nudged her shoulder with his soft nose, a silent question. She stroked his neck, her calloused fingers finding comfort in the familiar coarse hair. "It's just us, old boy," she murmured, her voice raspy. "We'll find a place." She swung herself up onto his bare back, her satchel clutched in one hand, the useless deed still crumpled in the other. She didn't look back at the town of Providence Gulch as she urged Jedediah toward the mouth of the canyon. She looked forward, toward the looming shadows of the mountains, toward the one place in the entire valley that was as forgotten and dismissed as she was. The path was steep and winding, leading away from the fertile valley floor and into the rocky throat of the high country. The air grew thin and sharp, with the scent of pine and cold stone. Every step Jedediah took felt like a step away from her past, from the life that had been ripped from her. The valley below, with its patchwork of ranches and the distant ribbon of the river, was a paradise she was being exiled from. Up here, the land was harsh, unforgiving, gnarled junipers clung to the stony slopes, and the wind had a lonely, keening sound. She rode until the last light bled from the sky, leaving only a wash of stars against an indigo canvas. Finally, she saw it. Set back from the trail, in a small, sheltered bowl of land, was the sealed entrance to the Silence Mine. It was a scar on the mountainside, a heap of rockfall and massive, weathered timbers jammed against the dark maw of the earth. A crude sign, faded and split, was nailed to a nearby pine. The words were barely legible. "Danger, keep out." It looked less like a warning and more like a gravestone. This was the dismissed object, the place of whispers and bad luck. The ground around it was rocky and uneven, dotted with hardy brush. But there was a small, relatively flat clearing a stone's throw from the entrance, sheltered by a granite outcrop. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even a decent campsite. But it was unclaimed. It was a place where no one would bother her, because no one ever came here. She slid off Jedediah's back, her legs stiff and cold. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Even the crickets were quiet here. It was the kind of silence that felt ancient and watchful. This was what she was reduced to: a woman, a mule, and a ghost of a mine on a piece of land nobody wanted. She had traded her father's legacy, a place of life and memory, for a patch of dirt next to a tomb. What secrets was this mountain holding? Was the mine truly just a place of bad luck? Or was there something more buried with the silver? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for the rest of Fanny's incredible story. As she stood there in the chilling darkness, little did she know that the ground beneath her feet held the answer not just to her own future, but to the stolen past of the entire valley. The next morning, Fanny rode Jedediah back into Providence Gulch for the few supplies she could afford. The town felt different now. Yesterday, she had been a resident, a landowner facing a dispute. Today, she was an outcast. As she walked toward the mercantile, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Whispers followed her like shadows. "That's her," a woman muttered to her companion, clutching her basket tighter. "The Marsh girl. Lost the valley place." Another group of men standing outside the saloon fell silent as she passed, their speculative gazes making her skin crawl. They weren't just looking at a woman who'd lost her home. They were looking at a loose thread, a problem that had, for now, conveniently removed itself. Inside the mercantile, the clerk who had been friendly just a week ago was suddenly brisk and efficient, avoiding her gaze as he measured out a small bag of flour and a handful of beans. The transaction was cold, clinical. She was no longer a neighbor. She was Charity, or worse, a ghost haunting the edges of their prosperous lives. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, a voice, loud and dripping with contempt, cut through the street noise. Well, look what the mountain coughed up. It was Elias Thorne, leaning against a post, a smug grin spreading across his face. "I heard you found new lodgings, Miss Marsh. Getting friendly with the ghosts up at the Silence?" His laughter was a sharp, ugly sound. A few of his cronies, loitering nearby, joined in. Fanny felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze, her expression a mask of stony indifference. She would not give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply turned, loaded her meager supplies onto Jedediah's back, and prepared to leave. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. "You run along," he called after her, his voice hard. "That's where people like you belong. In the shadows, with the other forgotten things." She didn't look back. She just kept walking, her back straight, each step a silent refusal to break. As she reached the edge of town, a figure stepped out from the narrow alley between the blacksmith and the livery. It was an old Ute woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a depth that seemed to span generations. The townspeople called her Salt Woman because she appeared only a few times a year to trade hides for salt, speaking to almost no one. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that made the bustling town seem flimsy and temporary. The old woman raised a hand, and Fanny instinctively stopped. She reached out a dry, warm hand and placed it gently on Fanny's forearm. Her touch was surprisingly firm, grounding. She looked from Fanny's face to the distant canyon where the mine lay hidden. "The mountain remembers," the woman said, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. "What the valley forgets." That was all. She gave Fanny's arm a final, reassuring squeeze, then turned and disappeared back into the alley as silently as she had appeared. Fanny stood frozen for a moment, the woman's words echoing in the sudden quiet. The mountain remembers what the valley forgets. It was a riddle, a proverb, a warning. She didn't know what. But it felt like the first true thing anyone had said to her all day. It settled in her heart not as a threat, but as a sliver of strange, unasked for hope. What had the valley chosen to forget? And what did the mountain where she now slept have to do with it? The question followed her all the way back up the winding trail, a single, persistent note in the symphony of her loss. The journey back to her makeshift camp felt different this time. The cryptic words of the old Ute woman had shifted something in the landscape. The mountain no longer felt like a place of exile, but one of secrets. When she arrived, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the pines, casting long shadows across the sealed mine entrance. The place was still and silent, but it was a silence that now felt less empty and more expectant. Fanny slid from Jedediah's back and let him graze on the sparse patches of grass. She took a moment to truly study her new surroundings. The mine was sealed with a jumble of massive timbers and what looked like half the mountainside. It was a chaotic mess, designed to look like a natural rock slide, but the sheer volume of it seemed excessive. Why go to such trouble to close a simple failed mine? She unpacked her supplies, her movements methodical and calming. She built a small, careful fire in a ring of stones she'd assembled the night before, the smoke rising thin and straight in the still air. As dusk began to settle, she sat on a flat rock, sipping hot, weak tea from a tin cup, her gaze fixed on the dark heap of the mine. This was her first real night living beside it, her first conscious act of making this place a temporary home. The sounds of the high country began to emerge as the light faded. The hoot of a distant owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind through the high branches of the ponderosas. But from the mine itself, there was nothing. A profound, unnatural stillness. As she listened, she watched Jedediah. The mule, who was usually skittish in new places, seemed remarkably at ease. Instead of staying close to the fire, he wandered over to the edge of the rockfall, sealing the mine. He stood there for a long time, his head lowered, his long ears pointed forward, perfectly still. He wasn't sniffing the air or pawing the ground. He was just listening. It was an odd behavior. Her father had always said you could trust a mule's instincts over a man's word. Animals felt things humans missed, a change in the weather, the scent of a predator, the tremor of the earth. Jedediah's calm vigilance was unsettling. He wasn't afraid, he was attentive. It was as if he were listening to a conversation she couldn't hear. Fanny wrapped her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the growing darkness. She laid out her bedroll near the granite outcrop, using her satchel as a pillow. The rock at her back still held a faint warmth from the day's sun. Lying there, staring up at the brilliant spray of stars, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. She was utterly alone, a tiny speck of life clinging to the edge of a great, silent mystery. The mountain loomed over her, a vast, dark shape against the sky. It felt ancient, powerful, and indifferent. Yet, the old woman's words returned to her. The mountain remembers. Lying there in the cold, Fanny closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it remembered. She thought of the miners who had worked here, their hopes for a silver fortune. She thought of the collapse, the story everyone in the valley avoided. Had men died in there? Was that the source of the bad luck, or was it something else entirely? A strange peace began to settle over her. For the first time since receiving Thorne's notice, the frantic panic in her chest subsided. The path forward was gone, her past was barricaded. All she had was this moment, this place, and for reasons she couldn't name, her mule's quiet stillness beside the dark mine felt less like an omen of danger and more like an invitation to listen. What was Jedediah hearing in the deep silence of the mountain? A week passed. Fanny fell into a spare, hard rhythm of survival. Mornings were spent gathering firewood and checking the simple snares she'd set for rabbits. Afternoons were for mending her worn clothes or simply sitting, watching the light change on the face of the mountain. She was becoming a part of the landscape, her presence as quiet and unobtrusive as the lichen on the rocks. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant companion. But it was slowly changing from a sharp pain into a dull, familiar ache. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled down from the peaks. Rain came in blinding sheets, turning her small campsite into a muddy soup. Torrents of water cascaded down the mountainside, washing loose dirt and rock toward her lean-to. Fearing a mudslide, Fanny grabbed her father's old shovel, the one tool she'd had the foresight to tie to Jedediah's pack, and began frantically digging a diversion trench. The work was brutal. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked her through to the bone, but a desperate energy fueled her. As she dug, her shovel striking rock and mud, she worked her way closer to the base of the mine's sealed entrance. The runoff was thickest there, sluicing away years of accumulated soil and scree. After the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping, Fanny stood panting, leaning on her shovel. Her trench had held. Her small camp was safe. It was then that she noticed it. The deluge had exposed something at the very bottom of the rockfall, the dark, glistening end of a wooden beam. It was different from the other timbers used to seal the mine. Those were rough-hewn pine logs, weathered to a silver gray. This piece was darker, denser, almost black with age and water. It looked like petrified oak, and it was set deeper, as if it were part of an older, buried structure. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she knelt in the mud and began to clear the remaining debris from around it. Her fingers, raw and cold, scraped away dirt and pebbles. As more of the wood was revealed, she saw the carving. It wasn't a name or a date. It was a precise, deliberate symbol, a perfect square with a single, straight line drawn vertically through its center. She'd seen marks like it before, on the old boundary stones of her father's property. It was a surveyor's mark. But it was a variation she didn't recognize, and it was in a place that made no sense. Why would a surveyor's mark be on a timber used to seal a mine, buried under tons of rock? It didn't fit the narrative of a simple, accidental collapse. It felt intentional. It felt like a clue. She tried to pry the beam loose, but it was wedged tight, a silent testament to some long-forgotten purpose. She sat back on her heels, the dripping forest silent around her, and stared at the strange symbol. It was a piece of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving. A single, anomalous detail in a story everyone else had accepted as truth. For days she had been living beside the mine, seeing it only as a monument to failure and bad luck. Now, for the first time, she saw it as something else. It wasn't just a sealed hole in the ground. It was a message. She just didn't know how to read it yet. Leaving the timber where it lay, she returned to her fire, her mind racing. The symbol was a loose thread, and Fanny Marsh, with nothing left to lose, felt a sudden, fierce determination to pull on it. A few days later, a man on horseback rode up the trail. Fanny, wary, watched him approach from the cover of the trees. He wasn't one of Thorne's rough-looking ranch hands. This man was lean and wore practical, clean clothes. He sat his horse with an easy confidence, but his eyes, as they scanned the landscape, were sharp and methodical. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from her camp. "Miss Marsh?" he called out, his voice calm and even. Fanny stepped into the clearing, her hand resting on the handle of the small axe she used for firewood. "I'm Fanny Marsh." The man dismounted, holding his hat in his hand. "My name is Nathan Vale. The Sterling Company hired me to survey the disputed boundary lines." Fanny's heart sank. He was one of them. She braced herself for another dismissal, another smug assertion of Thorne's power. But Nathan's expression held no malice. It was serious, professional, and perhaps a little weary. "I'm not here to trouble you," he said, seeming to read her thoughts. "My job is to measure the land, to record what is there. Nothing more." He had a quiet, direct way of speaking that she found herself trusting against her better judgment. Over the next few days, Nathan became a regular presence on the mountainside. He worked with a quiet intensity, setting up his transit, driving stakes, and making meticulous notes in a small leather book. He never intruded on her camp, but he would often greet her with a polite nod in the morning or a quiet good evening as dusk fell. One afternoon, he saw her staring at the exposed timber at the base of the mine. He walked over, his boots making little sound on the damp earth. "That's an interesting piece of oak," he said, his surveyor's eye immediately drawn to the carving. He knelt for a closer look. "Where did you find this?" "The storm washed it out," Fanny replied, watching him carefully. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He murmured, tracing the symbol with his finger. "That's a witness corner mark. An old one. Hasn't been used in 30 years. He looked from the beam to the chaotic heap of the mine seal, then back again. A witness corner is a reference point for a survey plat. It's used to mark a boundary line when you can't place a stone right on the corner itself. It points to the real marker. A slow dawning comprehension began to light in his eyes. This shouldn't be here. Not like this. His professional curiosity was piqued. The anomaly that had bothered Fanny now had a name and a function, and it was deeply out of place. While Nathan continued his official survey, a new kind of work began for Fanny. Driven by a purpose she hadn't felt in months, she started clearing the brush and loose rock from around the mine entrance. It wasn't a conscious decision to try and open it. It was a need to impose order on the chaos, to understand the shape of the thing she was living beside. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher. She learned the weight and balance of the rocks, the grain of the broken timbers. Jedediah often stood nearby, his quiet presence a comfort. Her labor was a form of investigation. With every rock she moved, every piece of rotten wood she cleared away, she was learning the grammar of the collapse, and the more she cleared, the more it looked wrong. Some of the other timbers, as she uncovered them, also bore markings, faded, painted numbers, a 3 on one, a V on another. They seemed random, meaningless. She pointed them out to Nathan one evening as he was packing up his equipment. He came over, his brow furrowed in thought. He sketched the numbers and the witness mark in his notebook. "This wasn't a cave-in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This was a construction, or a deconstruction. These numbers, they look like a sequence. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a question that was as massive and immovable as the mountain itself. Why would someone go to the trouble of systematically burying a mine and marking it with a secret survey point? The numbers on the timbers became their guide. Nathan, with his knowledge of old engineering and survey methods, began to see a pattern. The numbers weren't random. They indicated a sequence for demolition, a precise and deliberate collapse designed to be permanent. They sealed it from the inside out, he explained, pointing to how the main support beams had been cut and blasted. And this rockfall, it was directed. All of it. The witness mark on the oak beam was the key. According to the old surveying manuals Nathan kept in his saddlebags, that particular mark pointed toward a true survey monument, usually within 100 feet. But there was no monument stone anywhere in the clearing. Unless, Nathan said, his eyes scanning the jumble of the rockfall itself, the monument isn't on the mountain. What if it's in it? Their focus shifted. They weren't just clearing debris anymore. They were searching for a hidden doorway. Following the logic of the witness corner and the numbered beams, they began to concentrate their efforts on a section of the rockfall to the left of the main entrance. It looked as solid as the rest, but some of the larger boulders seemed oddly placed, wedged together in a way that defied natural physics. It was back-breaking work. For 2 days, they labored together, using pry bars Nathan fetched from his camp and the sheer stubborn strength of their bodies. Fanny worked with a focused intensity, her grief and anger channeled into the physical act of moving stone. Nathan, caught up in the mystery, worked alongside her, his quiet respect for her growing with every hour. Finally, their pry bar slid into a deep crevice and met with a hollow sound. With a final, coordinated heave, they dislodged a massive flat stone. It fell away with a deep groan, revealing not a mineshaft, but a small, dark alcove, deliberately hidden within the structure of the collapse. It was a man-made cavity, dry and protected, and inside, sitting on a dusty rock-cut shelf, was a rust-eaten tin box. A profound silence fell over them, broken only by their ragged breaths. This was it, the heart of the secret. Fanny reached into the darkness, her trembling fingers closing around the cold metal. She lifted the box out into the light. It was heavy. The lid was rusted shut, but Nathan managed to pry it open with the tip of his knife. The contents were not silver, nor gold, nor any treasure a miner would seek. The box was filled with paper. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Beneath it, a bundle of letters, tied with a faded piece of twine. Fanny lifted the ledger with reverent hands. She opened it. The first page was a title plate, the ink still dark and clear in the dry air. Official Survey of the Providence Valley, it read. Commissioned by the Territorial Office, 1848, Amos Albright, Certified Surveyor. Nathan let out a sharp, indrawn breath. Amos Albright, he whispered. He was a legend, the best there was. The story is he took a job out here and just vanished. Fanny turned the page. It was a map, exquisitely drawn, of the entire valley. And there, clearly marked with precise coordinates tied directly to the witness corner at the Silence Mine entrance, was her father's homestead. Plot 7, and next to it, Plot 8, Plot 9, Plot 10, a half-dozen other small homesteads, all legally registered, all their boundaries immutable and clear. It was the original, true survey of the valley. Then she picked up the letters. They were from Albright to his wife. Her hands shaking, she read the last one aloud. My dearest Anna, it began. I have uncovered a terrible fraud. The Sterling Cattle Company, through its agent, has bribed the land office and intends to file a false survey, erasing the claims of the settlers in the Northern Valley. They know I have the true plat. I have been threatened. I fear for my life. I have hidden the original ledger where they will never find it. I have sealed the evidence inside the mountain itself. If anything happens to me, the mountain will remember the truth. Fanny looked up at Nathan, her eyes wide with the enormity of their discovery. The Silence Mine wasn't a failed silver strike. It was a tomb for the truth. It had been sealed to bury the proof of a crime that had stolen the valley, piece by piece, for 30 years. Her father's deed wasn't a forgery. It was the last echo of a truth everyone had been forced to forget. The discovery of the ledger changed everything, but it also presented a new, more dangerous problem. They held the truth in their hands, but Elias Thorne and the Sterling Cattle Company held the valley in their fist. Presenting the ledger to the same corrupt clerk who had dismissed Fanny's deed would be suicide. The book would simply disappear, and so, perhaps, would they. They needed a plan, but before they could form one, the mountain made a decision of its own. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the peaks, and the temperature plummeted. An early, vicious autumn blizzard, the kind that could kill a man in an hour, was bearing down on them. "We need to get you to town," Nathan said urgently, already moving to gather his things. But it was too late. The first flakes, thick and wet, were already falling. The wind rose to a piercing shriek, and the world dissolved into a blinding vortex of white. They scrambled for the shelter of Fanny's lean-to, reinforcing it against the granite outcrop as the storm hit with full fury. They huddled together, the wind tearing at their small refuge, the ledger and letters wrapped safely in oilcloth between them. The world shrank to the small circle of their fire and the howling darkness beyond. Hours passed. The snow piled up in massive drifts, burying the landscape. Sometime deep in the night, over the roar of the wind, they heard a faint cry. A human sound. Nathan and Fanny exchanged a look. To go out in this was madness. To ignore it was unthinkable. Tying a rope around his waist and giving the other end to Fanny, Nathan ventured into the blizzard. He returned minutes later, half carrying a snow-caked figure. It was Elias Thorne. He was barely conscious, his face pale and his lips blue. His horse had thrown him, and his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He had been checking on his cattle on the high range, caught by the storm's sudden violence. Without a word, Fanny moved aside, making room for him by the fire. She tore a strip from her own spare blanket to make a crude splint for his leg, her movements deft and sure. She brewed the last of her tea and forced the hot liquid between his chattering teeth. Thorne, delirious with pain and cold, looked up at her, his eyes struggling to focus. He saw the woman he had scorned, the woman he had driven from her home, now saving his life. "Why?" he croaked, the word a puff of frosted air. Fanny didn't answer. She just pulled another blanket over him, one of the two she owned. Nathan watched her, a look of profound admiration on his face. He had warned her earlier that day that a man like Thorne would never repay such a kindness. "I know," she had said simply. This act wasn't for Thorne. It was for herself. It was a quiet declaration. Her fight was not against a single, cruel man. It was for a principle. It was for the truth, and her humanity was not something she was willing to sacrifice to win. Sheltering her enemy in her meager camp, using her own scant resources to save him from the storm, she was committing fully to the person she was, the person her father had raised her to be. The ledger could prove she owned the land, but this act, in the heart of the blizzard, proved she deserved it. As the storm raged on, the three of them, the wronged, the witness, and the villain, were trapped together. A strange tableau of justice and mercy in the heart of the silent mountain. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was a pristine, silent wilderness of white. The snow was waist-deep, the air clean and bitingly cold. Thorne's fever had broken, but his leg was badly swollen. He was weak, humbled, and for the first time since Fanny had met him, utterly silent. His arrogance had been stripped away by the storm and her quiet, unhesitating compassion. Nathan, using makeshift snowshoes, made the arduous journey down to Providence Gulch for the doctor. He returned late the next day with Doc Abernathy, a kind, no-nonsense man who had tended to everyone in the valley for 40 years. The doctor examined Thorne's leg, setting the bone with practiced efficiency. "A nasty break," he said, "but you'll live. Thanks to Miss Marsh here." His eyes, full of a quiet intelligence, lingered on Fanny, then on the strange camp set up against a sealed mine. While he worked, Nathan laid the old ledger on a dry rock. "Doc," he said, "I think you need to see this." Abernathy wiped his hands and picked up the book. He opened it, his eyes scanning the title page. He went still. "Amos Albright," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "My God. I was just a boy, but I remember him. My father knew him. When he disappeared, everyone said he'd run off with the Survey Commission's money. The Sterling Company spread the story themselves." He turned the pages, his expression shifting from disbelief to dawning comprehension, and finally to a slow-burning anger. This changes everything. The journey back to town was a strange procession. Thorne was strapped to a litter dragged by Nathan's horse. Fanny rode Jedediah, the precious ledger held securely in her lap. When they arrived, word of Thorne's rescue and the reason for Nathan's journey had already begun to spread. People came out of their homes and businesses, not with whispers and averted eyes, but with open curiosity and a dawning respect. They saw Fanny Marsh, the woman they had dismissed, riding into town not as an outcast, but as a savior, carrying a truth that had been buried for 3 decades. At the county office, Doc Abernathy and Nathan presented the ledger to the sweating clerk. Faced with the unimpeachable evidence of the original plat, witnessed by the town's most respected doctor, the clerk's blustering defense of the Sterling deed crumbled. He unlocked a dusty cabinet and produced the official plat on file, a cruder, simpler map. It was a clear forgery. The news spread through the valley like a grass fire. Other families who had been forced to sell their land to the Sterling Company for pennies on the dollar over the years, who had been told their own deeds were flawed, began to appear. An old man came forward with a story of his father being threatened off his land. A widow spoke of a mysterious fire that had destroyed their barn just before they were forced to sell. Fanny's discovery hadn't just reclaimed her own home, it had given a voice to a generation of injustice. The Sterling Cattle Company, faced with a mountain of evidence and the collective fury of the valley, folded. Their lawyers sent word from Denver. They were withdrawing all claims based on the fraudulent survey and would offer financial restitution to the affected families. Elias Thorne was quietly recalled by the company, disappearing from Providence Gulch as suddenly as he had appeared, his public humiliation complete but private. The townspeople now looked at Fanny with a kind of reverence. She was no longer the Marsh girl. She was the woman who had listened to the mountain. The last rays of the autumn sun bathed the valley in a soft, golden light. Fanny stood on the porch of her father's cabin, her home, now indisputably hers. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the wood smoke curling from her chimney. The windows, which had been dark and empty for weeks, now glowed with the warm light of a lantern. She had come home. Nathan Vale stood beside her, leaning against a porch post. His work was done. The new old boundaries were being recorded, and the Sterling Company's fraudulent claims were being systematically dismantled. He could have left a week ago, but he had stayed. He looked out over the valley, a patchwork of gold and green stretching to the horizon. "It's a beautiful place," he said quietly. "Your father chose well." Fanny followed his gaze, but her eyes were drawn higher, toward the dark line of the mountains to the north, to the place where the Silence Mine lay hidden. She had no intention of reopening it. The silver within it was worthless compared to the truth it had guarded. It had served its purpose. It could rest now. "What will you do now?" Nathan asked, his voice gentle. The question hung in the peaceful air. She could sell. She could leave. She had been vindicated, and she was free. But as she looked at the fields her father had cleared, at the sturdy cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, she felt the deep, anchoring pull of roots. She had fought for a piece of paper, for a deed, for a legal right. But in the process, in the hardship and the discovery, she had found something more. She had found her place, not just on the map, but in the story of the valley itself. She finally turned her gaze from the mountain to the land before her, her land. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. "My father left me a homestead," she said, her voice clear and steady in the evening quiet. But this valley, we earned that back together. Her words held the simple, profound weight of the story's moral. Inheritance wasn't just property passed down. It was a truth to be stewarded, a community to be restored. She had been cast out, only to find that in the wilderness, she had uncovered the very thing that would bring everyone home. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this incredible journey. This has been a story about the enduring power of hidden truths, and how the things and people a world dismisses often hold the key to its healing. If you were moved by Fanny's story, we'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of quiet courage and unexpected discovery. We'll be back soon with the story of an old blacksmith who was given a single, rusted key and told it would open a future he never knew he had.